We're so excited today to announce the second cohort of Global Youth Visionaries, who for AMP represent the power of young people to impact their world. Visionaries speak with our network and receive a monetary award to support their work. In this fall, the AMP network reviewed and nominated the work of youth leaders around the world. We're so honored to present to you the 3 outstanding young climate justice leaders receiving this award. First off today, we have Eduarda Zilbi from Brazil. Eduarda is a political scientist working towards her MPA at Columbia University, where she's concentrating in energy and environment while spearheading the Center on Global Energy Policies, Women in Energy program to Brazil. Eduarda served as an energy and gender consultant at Sustainable Energy for All, where she worked on electricity access policies and mainstreaming gender in energy projects to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal number 7. Most recently, she was selected for the Atlantic Council's Women Leaders in Energy Fellowship and received the North American Association for Environmental Education's 30 Under 30 Award. Welcome, Eduarda. We're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here.
Yes. Alrighty. Our 2 other visionaries, we're expecting one more to join us, and we have a recorded interview from the other. We have Nisreen El-Saim from Sudan. Nisreen is a Sudanese environmental and climate activist with her bachelor's degree in physics and master's in renewable energy from the University of Khartoum. Nisreen has been involved in climate activism since 2012, and she is the chair of Sudan Youth Organization on Climate Change, as well as coordinator with Youth and Environment Sudan, or YES. Nisreen was recently chosen to chair the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory on Climate Change, along with 6 other climate activists. And finally, we have Eric Steinberger from Germany. Eric is the CEO and founder of Climate Science, a UK charity providing accurate, complete, and accessible learning resources about realistic solutions to climate change. Their team has over 130 volunteers and produces courses, booklets for children, and event programs. Eric did AI research at MIT and Facebook, and as well as his work focusing on deep reinforcement learning and its application to multi-agent domains. He gives conferences and talks on realistic climate solutions and on interesting topics in machine learning. His mission is to make content engaging and digestible for non-experts. So before we start our conversation with the amazing Eduarda, we do have a recorded interview with Eric, which I'm going to play for you all right now. Unless Karen has it up. I've just lost the video because Google Drive is giving me trouble, but I'm really looking forward to you all getting to hear this. Eric is absolutely fantastic, and unfortunately could not join us today because of time constraints, but he has some amazing messages for you all. Alrighty.
Yeah.
And I will share my screen. Ladies and gentlemen, Eric Steinberger to MIT and Facebook and been named.
Thank you for the kind intro. It's a pleasure to be here.
Alrighty, well, let's hop directly into some questions. So you run an international climate education startup. What do you think is the key to reaching and engaging learners on a global scale?
Empathy. I think we need to understand how people need to be presented with the information. I think just presenting information is not sufficient if your goal is for people to actually, have to read it. It says, unfortunately, we see that propaganda promoting initiatives are much better at understanding this than science communicators. So I think it's time for sort of science communicators across topics and fields, not just in climate, but especially in climate, to really learn that and to understand that it's not just about saying the numbers, it's also about how you say them.
I love that. I think that especially hits home as we enter year 3 of the pandemic with misinformation flying around everywhere. At least
yeah, weirdly, like those promoting misinformation, and I do want to say, like, misinformation is used very well. There's lots of misinformation. There's also just some uncertainty in some things, which is totally fine and viable. But where misinformation is promoted, unfortunately, we see that those people are very good at empathetically, emotionally reaching people, where scientists are typically not. So I agree. Like, it's very much applicable to the pandemic too.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, your background and training is largely in computer science and physics. What brought you into climate work and the climate movement?
I Googled how to solve climate change and I wasn't satisfied with the answers. So we built better answers. Now we rank first when you Google climate science.
Wow,
Gold.
get that, folks. For our youth participants around the globe, there's nothing they want to hear more than that, because every single one of them has done that. So every single one.
See, like I'm a nerd. That's what I if I had to describe myself with one word, like sure, I look for whatever. But I'm a nerd by heart. That's why I studied computer science. And so when you have a question, you Google it. And you expect, so I started, as you said, I started studying online very early through programs like MIT OpenCourseWare, Khan Academy, just so, the fun stuff that's there for curious kids. And then I found answers to pretty much all the questions I Googled, but I didn't find an answer to how to solve climate change, which oddly, given it's one of the most important challenges of our generation, I did think should be there, and it wasn't. There's lots of conflicting information. So as you said, we felt we needed to provide something better. Hence, I did put quite a lot of my time over the last 2.5 years into climate and climate education. Learned a lot on the way myself. I'm not a climate scientist, so it was a great educational journey for me too. Luckily, we have a great team, so learning a lot from them.
Truly, and that I think is so powerful for a background of youth in our community. Alrighty. Well, you think young people in climate work are often spoken over and even disregarded, even when they're wielding data and science on their side. Are there ways in which you've been ignored in your time fighting for climate action, and how did you deal with them?
I can't recall that personally. So I hear that actually quite often. It's surprising to me because no, I really haven't had that problem, luckily. I don't know, maybe it's an approach. I think a lot of people walk into conversations with the intention to convince others and to change their mind on and change their opinion, which immediately puts you in the shoes of the one trying to, by trying to have an effect, you leave it open for the other side in a conversation to determine whether you're successful or not. And hence you may be ignored. And frankly, if someone tried to convince you that climate change is not important, you may also be you may also choose to ignore that person. So, while clearly the science is on the side of climate change being incredibly important, I think from an empathetic and emotional perspective, it's very important how you do it. So maybe I haven't faced this problem because I try to not approach things with the let's convince the other person methodology. If someone asks and if someone is curious to learn more about climate change, they will, and then if someone asks me a question about it, I will answer it, and then I tend to not be ignored because they ask the question. When it comes to things like partnerships and talking to leaders of various places, it's again like typically it just depends. You can't really be ignored if you only talk to people who are open to conversation. And I just choose to not run after people. So if someone chooses to be a climate denier, okay, we live in a world that's just composed of a lot of atoms with the basic rules being determined simply by physics and not by ethics. So I can't change that. The rules of the universe don't make me, don't give me the capability to do so. And I find weirdly, the less you try to convince people, the more you convince people. So in a way, it's kind of worked the other way around.
Wow, that's powerful, especially. Alrighty, well, that is a small clip of our interview with Eric, and I thought that message especially hit home for me as not chasing the people who aren't ever intending to believe you. And now we're going to hear a little bit from Eduarda. We'll have some questions for her, and if you have questions as well, please put them in the chat. Eduarda is an energy policy student and expert, I have to say. And I'll see. All right. So we asked this earlier on our career panel. We had a clean energy expert here. What do you think is the future for the clean energy transition, and what does that timeline look like?
Well, I think that that's a really tough question. Maybe the future of the energy transition will definitely have more electrification. So we're talking more and more, not only about deploying renewable energy, but also trying to think of how we can improve the existing infrastructure for our grids. So I'll give you an example that is very common in many countries now, especially emerging markets, such as my country, Brazil, in which we have, for example, a lot of wind plants that have already been installed, but we don't have the transmission lines to connect that wind generation to the grid. And that's a major challenge because what I see, especially in terms of finance, you see that most of the energy finance is going to new energy, right? To deploying new sources. But we have to think more and more about infrastructure. So in my country, for example, in 2019, more than half of our existing transmission lines already, surpassed that period when they have to be substituted. So it's aging infrastructure that all countries have to account when they're thinking about the future of energy. And the future of energy includes more people. So in the next decade, in the next 30 years, we're going to have more people in the world demanding more energy. So I also think that it has a very strong component of energy efficiency. So we as consumers have a responsibility to consume energy inside of our households and commercial buildings when we go to work in the best way possible. And there are a lot of ways to solve this, but one of the ways is installing smart meters. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of energy because if you're if you're a person interested in climate change, it can get a little boring. But I think that ultimately, I always bring the narrative of the SDG 7. So in the UN 2030 agenda, we have the SDG 7, which relates to affordable and clean and reliable energy for all by 2030. And most people see the SDG 7 only as the renewable energy component of it. However, we also have another aspect that is the energy aspect, energy access aspect, which is what I used to work with at Sustainable Energy for All. And this has to do with the fact that today we still have over 700 million people that do not have access to electricity. Most of these people are located in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, and also in the Caribbean and Latin America. So when we're thinking about the future of energy, we also have to think about those who do not have access, because the whole 2030 agenda has a very strong sense of not leaving anyone behind. So I think that relates a lot with the topic, of the event, and the fact that when we think about climate justice, we have to think of people who do not have a voice in the decision-making processes in their cities, in their countries, people that are, that suffer a lot from not having access to energy, or even from the perspective of my country with the pandemic and the increase in poverty. People are having less and less resources to pay for energy. And energy means development. It means many times that people can have more income in their households because they have access to electricity. It means children having, being able to study it during the weekends at night. It means women who are safer by walking in the streets and having public lights lighting their way home. So I think maybe last point about, how I see the future of energy. I also see young people. So more and more I try to bring young people to have like this idea that in order to tackle climate change, we have to change and completely disrupt the energy system the way as it is today. And we need more young people with innovative visions, with innovative solutions to come enjoy this movement of let's rethink the energy system as it is, because we need solutions for deploying more energy, for improving infrastructure, for making better use of finance, and for also enabling access for those who don't have electricity.
Thank you. That's such an incredible frame for our discussion, both around climate justice and how energy plays into that. I love that. Another question, you fought for global policy and change and policy within Brazil, which is an enormous undertaking. What do you think is the key to reaching and engaging people on a global or national scale?
I think that the national scale, it starts from communities, like smaller communities and groups of people that have like-minded views about the environment. And I'll say this, and I always highlight why it's so important to have, different youth groups that are involved with each other. And the key example is Engajamundo, which is a youth-led NGO that I volunteered for years, which Renata, your keynote speaker from today, she was also from Engajamundo, and that's where I met her. So, different Brazilians that you'll meet around the world at COPs, at different events, and that are engaged in climate, they usually were part of Engajamundo. So I think that youth-led groups and grassroots organizations, they play a very important role in influencing national policy. So I think that another example is trying to get involved as a young person in decisions that are happening, not only because sometimes we think of policy like I want to change the constitution, but sometimes making a strong and impactful policy change can happen in your building, it can happen in your school. So I think that you have to start gaining this experience from the beginning of being that type of person that sees a problem and doesn't accept the problem and stay living their lives as if nothing was happening. And I think all of us that are working with climate change and are trying to do something about it since a very early age, we've always seen the problem and wanted to do something about it. And we found people, we found networks of others that thought the same way as we did. I also think that in the sense of impacting policy, I see the role of mentorship as being very important because we don't get there alone. So a lot of the places that I was able to occupy, to be in a hearing in Congress in Brazil, or being in a UN meeting, or being in COP as I've been, you don't get there just alone. You decide that you want to make a change and you just go. You usually, I think networks are important, but I also had very important people in my life that helped me to get there, told me what would stand out in my resume, for example, to get into a position that I would eventually be able to attend these events, or like what type of skills I would need to perform in a way that would impact most people, exactly the way you're doing in the conference. I think that these discussions are very rich because we learn from each other, and I think that all of us have the potential to make impactful change in our communities.
Absolutely. Yes. I'm learning so much from you right now. Yeah, that was, no, definitely. I appreciate that. And the ongoing theme of solidarity and mentorships and networks has really threaded through this weekend, which I love. So you talked about being at COP, and that was a huge conference and so huge around the world. There were tens of thousands of people there. I guess, what were some of the biggest takeaways for you from COP?
I think that, first of all, I think COP has changed a lot over the years. My first attempt to attend a COP was when I'm currently 28. So my first attempt, I was only 16, and that was COP 15 in Denmark. I was an exchange student there. And I tried to go in, but at that time in 2009, there wasn't such thing as having youth inside of COP. It was only for government officials and, lead negotiators in the country. So this space didn't exist. And, more than 10 years later, I see how much that has changed in this past COP, how much civil society is everywhere. And some of the most important discussions are not actually happening in behind closed doors where the government officials are, but actually where the civil society is, where they're building connections and negotiating. So for me, it was really, I think it was a very emotional moment to see, for example, that Brazilian youth at COP reached, I think 80 people, 80 representatives that were indigenous, from all different racial backgrounds. And I think it was incredible because the only other time that I attended COP was in what year was that? 2016. And back then, I think the group of youth was 10 people. And that was already huge that we managed to get 10 people to COP to be, discussing with policymakers. And so I think that changed a lot. And that is something that gives me hope. Another, I think, takeaway is that the challenge cannot be, just placed upon the government. I see a lot of people that from across all sectors, not only in energy, but in all the sectors related to climate change, that they blame a lot the leaders in their countries. And currently my country has a leader that doesn't even believe in climate change. So I think that's when it shows that the private sector and civil society have a central role in leading what we believe climate solutions are. And that's what the conference showed, I think, for me, is that a lot of the things that were decided came from pressure from these different groups that were there and are going to be carried out and implemented in their own countries by the people that were there, not necessarily, like I said, behind closed doors. But I think that there's huge potential, especially for young people that are more and more involved in COPs and bringing up their perspective and the reality from different countries, which I think is many times makes me feel desperate, because when you hear what's going on in the world from young people's perspectives, it's devastating. But then again, they're the ones that are doing something about it.
Yes, that's such an insight into, I know personally, I was watching COP from afar and I felt really discouraged by the end of it. I think the news was showing COP of failure, but it wasn't in so many ways, especially for youth. Really, send it 80 youth from Brazil is incredible. Um, yeah, so one other question that I think really impacts our youth leaders and that's been spoken about across this weekend. We think sometimes it's really intimidated to get started on project or advocacy. And what's your advice for starting something new?
I think that my advice is being bold and not giving up instantly when you think that it's hard to get there. Some of the things I did, and now going to concrete examples, I've always been a person that was crazy about, for example, if I attended COP, was because, and this is like, let me give you this example because it's really good to show like how sometimes it may sound impossible, but you can make it happen if you really believe in what you're doing. So in my case, I'm studying at Columbia University, and usually students don't go to COP. And I went as an official member of the Columbia University delegation. But what did I do? I had to understand who are the people deciding within the university, the people that were going to integrate the delegation to COP. So I went to the UNFCCC, who organizes the COPs. I went to their website to understand who was the focal point at Columbia. So I wrote the focal point of Columbia 6 months before the conference, explaining who I was, everything that I've done, why I thought that I really should be a person that should go to COP and represent Columbia, represent my country. And months had passed, and I started talking to a lot of professors, emailing a lot of people. Even like mobilizing Columbia University social media to ask them to show my work so that they knew that I'm not, I wasn't kidding. I was really doing a lot of things for the causes that I believed in. And then 2 weeks before the conference, maybe a month before the conference, I emailed them again and they said, we're almost sure that you're going to get in. Just hold tight. Like, please don't share this with anyone because it's not something we usually do. So in the end, I was able to get to get into COP, to get the accreditation through my university. But this is just like, of course, it's a very small example. I really admire youth who are entrepreneurs, who are like starting a business from scratch related to recycling, related to energy efficiency, because I think that is much harder. It's just an example of like, I think connections are very important. So trying to understand who can help you, who can be a partner. And in this case, like if you want to be an entrepreneur, if you want to change a policy, even let's say at the national level, if I want to change, like one thing that drives me crazy about here living in New York is the use of straws. Like in Brazil, we have almost completely banned plastic straws. And here, even if you ask for water, they'll put a straw inside. So of course, I've been here for a short period of time, but like as an American youth, I would be, extremely upset about that and try to understand, okay, so to change my city legislation related to plastic straws, who should I contact? And here in the US, the Sunrise Movement is very big, also a youth-led grassroots organization. So I think the question is always like, if I want to solve a problem, who are the people that are involved and that have the power to change this? Then once you identify those people, I think you start building a movement. Who else agrees with me? Should we write a petition? Should we reach out to this person? Should we schedule a meeting? And surprisingly, we usually think that these people are not going to answer us, are going to ignore us. Most times they will listen because as government representatives, they're here to listen. So I think that's it. You have to start mapping out the problem, mapping out who's responsible for making the change, and finding people to engage that have the same perspectives that you do.
I love that mindset and that initiative. And clearly it took you so far. I've seen the video on the Columbia School of International Public Affairs on their website. They have Eduarda, professional camera, HDTV. It's awesome. So this is the power of self-advocacy, folks. All right, we have an audience question from Mariam from Georgia. I think she wants to talk about your COP 2016 experience, I believe. How were you able to attend that if you were not at the university student at the time? And how were you able to get funded to join that? I think that's the first question from her.
Okay, I'll respond in two different ways because first, I did not go inside. I stayed outside protesting with other young people who weren't a lot at the time. So I tried everything I could to get in. I, entered the UNFCCC website. There, usually they only granted access to the green zone, which if I don't know if people know, but there's during COPs, there's the blue zone and the green zone. The green zone is open to everyone. You usually just have a lot of different organizations just showcasing different panels or different findings from research that they did. The blue zone is where the negotiations happen. At the time, it was impossible to get into the blue zone. Like no young representative was there unless they were a government representative. So I did not go in. I tried. And when I say an attempt is because at the time, things were so different that it wasn't even something that was, no one conceived the idea of having youth in these events. This is very new. So yeah, that's one thing. Now, to answer the question about funding, I did, my first COP was COP22 in Marrakesh in 2016. The funding, the thing I did was to get, okay, and this is like my personal example that I think works. More often than not, if you ask people for a small amount of money and you explain why, they will help you out. And I've also learned with, attending different fundraising events that sometimes individuals will give you more funding than an organization. So for instance, if you try to attempt to get like a Greenpeace email, like a regular, like contact@greenpeace.com, you're not going to get funding because they don't know who you are. They have like their own programming. They can't just like give funding for you, a random person, to attend COP. However, going back to like the connections and contacts you have, like think about who, even in your family, would be someone that would help you afford a trip, and obviously, depending on your background, where you're from, outside of your family, who are your friends, or who maybe are organizations that are working with youth. I would always do a lot of research and start mapping these organizations, and even the youth that had already went to COP, like what did they do? I always ask them, because for me in Brazil, it was obviously, I couldn't afford just traveling around and staying 2 weeks. So what I did was I emailed a lot of people I knew. I received a lot of no's. I think I sent 10 emails. From the 10 emails, only 2 people answered. One was no, and the other one was yes. And the yes was someone that I met who was a professor. I only had a contact with this person once. I got her business card, and networking is very important. Remember to always have a business card available and get the person's business card, because a year after I met her, I emailed her, and she worked for a Dutch organization called Both Ends that works with climate and gender. And I messaged her saying like, look, I've always wanted to go to COP. I told this whole story. I tried years ago when I was in Denmark. It was impossible. This time I'm involved in a youth-led NGO that gave me the accreditation, but I can't afford going. And then I specified, like I said, this is exactly how I need without any luxury. I was like, I don't remember, like, let's say $2,000. Because I was like, this is going to cover the flight, the hotel, and food for all the days. And like, this is it. And she said, yes, we actually have resources from, they had a grant from the Dutch government. And then usually, and I say this because I've worked for an international organization, usually when you receive grants, sometimes by the end of the grant, there's like this residual, like $5,000, which for us individuals can be a lot of money. But for people implementing projects, it's nothing. And they usually don't use the money because they can't, they can't do anything with that money in the project. So asking for funding for that, which aligned with their work. And also I always, whenever I reach out to these organizations, I offer something in return. I'm like, okay, I can cover the event. I can do videos. I can write, articles about how it was. I can interview people, because you also don't want it to be just, you just don't want to ask for money directly. You can say like, look, at the end of the email, this is what I would need. It would be a life-changing experience for me. And I would be more than happy to contribute with, for example, I used to have a podcast, so I know how to edit podcasts. So I could potentially offer to do a podcast or video editing. And if you don't know any of that, learn on YouTube. Nowadays, it's so easy. I learned on my own how to edit podcasts. So, you can always offer something that for them could be relevant, or go to their website and say like, oh, I saw that you like doing this. I'm doing research in this area. Why don't I do like some research for you for free in exchange for funding to go? So I think that that's kind of like the way that I would go about that.
Wow, this is so inspiring, guys. This advice will get you into COP. This will get you so many places. Wow, oh my gosh, this is so cool. Masal, who's my partner for this conference, who organized it together with me, is actually in Marrakesh right now. She lives in Morocco, and she's so excited that you went. Alrighty, we have more. Oh wait, let me read this question. Thing COP 27. All right. If you have any audience questions, if you would like to ask them, please put them in the chat. But for now, I do have another question for you. So advocacy brings in people at all different stages of their lives and for all different reasons. What brought you into climate work and the climate movement as a young person?
Wow, that's actually a good story. I tell everyone this because it was something very random, but it was at school. I was in fifth grade, and I had a teacher that was my favorite teacher. We had a great relationship, and she knew I was interested in environmental things. Like I always talked about it, about the nature, very, in a very basic level. And Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, not sure if any of you have seen it, but you should. The first documentary had just come out, and she gave me a DVD, which I don't know how young people are in the call, but she gave me a DVD to watch about the documentary. She said, I think you're going to like it. And I was, I think 11, 12, and I saw it, and I was, in shock with the fact that I did not know what climate change was. And I instantly understood what was going on in the world. And I was asking myself, why aren't we talking about this? In schools, in our families, this is such a huge deal. Why aren't we doing anything about it? And I think it started then. Since I was like 11, 12, I've always been engaged with like climate issues. I made all my academic and professional decisions based on, I need to do something about this, and always thinking of mobilizing people. There's a lot of people that will say that, oh, it doesn't make any difference, me as a consumer stopping to do this, because if the industries, if like the factories don't change, it's not going to have any impact. I completely disagree. I'm a firm believer in having like a multiplier effect. So if I start doing something, tell the people around me, they're going to start sharing with the people around them. And I often hear this, like people that my first job out of college, I worked with politics. It had nothing to do with climate. And that's when I was the most engaged with the youth-led organization, because I would do volunteer work with something I believed in, and then would get a job because I had to be paid. So I was doing both, and I would tell everyone in my job like about it. And they would often tell me like, I never thought about these things. It's so interesting that you bring this up. And most people don't think about it. I think nowadays climate change is thankfully becoming more mainstream, that everyone is at least a little aware of what's going on. But seriously, 5 years ago, 10 years, especially 10 years ago, it was not like that. When I was starting college, for example, my background is in political science. So in college, it was like none of my students. I didn't even, for example, for my thesis, there was no one at my university that was like a climate specialist. And I studied in one of the best universities in my country. I wanted to write my thesis about it, and I couldn't find like a coordinator, the person, that's my thesis mentor. I think this is how you refer to it. I couldn't find someone that was like a climate expert, because it was such a new topic. Like we don't have a lot of experts. And now it's the opposite. Now I see more and more people that went to school with me asking me, I want to get into like sustainability issues. What should I do? Now everyone wants to do it. And I think it's wonderful. I think no matter what your sector is, no matter what your background is, if you find climate is very cross-cutting to everything. So yeah, I hope I answered the question.
Oh, you definitely answered the question. That's so inspiring. That totally answers our question. And you have so much wisdom to share. And I think it parallels so much of what Eric said in the interview. And I hope you all will watch that after, send it to you all. He said, I first found out and got into climate work when I Googled what is climate change and how do I stop it? And I think it has parallels with your elementary experience. Like my teacher gave me a DVD. It starts so small, and that's so incredible. We have another question for our audience. This is a private message to me. Do you think the UN is the right machine or engine to address climate policy right now? Or is there another way? Does it need to be national, or is the UN the right place for us to be?
I will say that I see a lot of people, just like in governments, depositing a lot of hope in the UN. I think that international organizations have a very important role in being the ones leading these conversations. They're the ones that organize the events. They're the ones that do the hardest work, which is getting country representatives involved, and especially those in countries that emit more greenhouse gases. So I think that their role is of mobilizing, of getting people to sign treaties, which are very important and everything. But I do think that we need especially more youth in governments, as politicians, in ministries, all of that, because I think that a big part of the work is implementation, and the UN, I think, does the step before. The UN does the, let's gather everyone, let's make the discussion, let's make the treaty. But if you believe in, hands-on work of going to a community and understanding what's your impact, I think that, and I say this, I don't want to be demeaning in any way of the UN, but I see a lot of people our age wanting to work in the UN to change the world. And I've seen people changing the world around them in a much smaller level, in communities, and just, being a school teacher, you have so much responsibility in shaping the next generation of people in your country. I think that, for example, building capacity for teachers in schools to talk about climate change is something that has a huge effect, and it has nothing to do with the UN. So I would just say that there's a role, and a very important one, for the UN, but it's not the only one. And as young people, if there's something I would love to see, is that in the next 10 years, more and more people like us are trying to be part of our governments, because young people generally have lost their faith in politics. So that's why they need us so much. And just to end in a note that I think is inspiring, that I heard from, Greta a couple of years ago, gave an interview, and that this interview spoke to me a lot, because she said that the world doesn't have time for someone her age to become a politician or a minister or a president of a country. There's not enough time for all of that to happen. And I thought to myself, I'm someone who has been in the movement long before her, and I'm at the time in my career where I have to start thinking of these decisions. So I think that that's what it is. It's just not trying to think of the UN as the central way of tackling climate change, but one of the many, many ways that you can do something about it.
Wow, that's so impactful, and I adore that. I think it's so timely and relevant to our group. Many, model UN students, young politicians in the making, young, engaging, young educators even. And yeah, no, that definitely hits home for me, and I'm sure many others. And another question we've asked throughout this weekend that I just want to present to you, that I know you've touched on a little bit already, is what solutions do you see working on the horizon in climate issues, and how do you think how do they center equity and all voices in climate?
So one of the topics that I work a lot with, in addition to energy, is gender. So I think that when we think of equity, just equity is already really hard, really challenging. So thinking of equality, I think that we need to start thinking of equality in more concrete ways. And I see a lot of organizations taking a stand, saying, for example, we'll hire, by 2025, by 2030, we'll have 50% of women in the organization, part of our business, our group. But I think that it's taking too long, and I think that especially for climate change, and I can speak more about the energy sector, because I think climate in general, like biology, environmental sciences, environmental management, those are careers that have generally a more equal division of male, female. It's slightly more equal than other sectors, such as the energy sector. The energy sector is crazy, not just in Brazil, but everywhere in the world. Look who are the energy ministers, look who works in energy ministries, and even businesses. If you see pictures of all the international and national oil and gas companies, are all men. It's incredible. It's almost as if it's a topic only for men. So I think that it is a huge responsibility for us, for the young generation that will make the decisions, to understand what gender is and understand a word that for me is hard to describe, but the concept of mainstreaming. Mainstreaming gender. I remember in my previous job before starting grad school, I asked my boss, like, what would you want me to learn in grad school? Like, I came here to study energy. She told me, one of the most important skills you have to look for like a class or talk to professors is understanding how to mainstream gender, because donors, like the financial institutions, they're more and more going to be, wanting to fund projects and organizations that have a better gender equality, and even not even gender equality, I have to say diversity, companies that are being diverse, and with this increasingly important concept that is ESG, environmental social governance. This, I think, has put a very great weight on companies to start changing their businesses. But I still think that is a reality in the global north. That perspective is still not seen in the global south. So like ESG is just starting to become something in Brazil. And I think that this just shows that when we're looking for solutions, we know that when we have people from diverse backgrounds, we have much better outcomes. There are a lot of studies like from McKinsey and a lot of other organizations that show that diversity has a huge impact on the work environment, on solutions, on even financial outcomes, on how much the company is making over a year, having a more diverse team. So I think that equality and like trying to bring more women, bring more youth, bring all minorities that have been completely overlooked over the years to be part of these decision processes is very important. And then the last point that I just made in the last answer, but I love to talk about this because I think it's very important, but also in politics, we still have most countries in the world with a very low representation of women in politics. So not only in the national level, but also in local, municipal, city level, we just need more women and more of this representation, diversity in governments, because ultimately they're the ones making decisions. And if we want more equality, we need them to understand why this is so important. And, all of you listening to this, I really, really hope you get into, integrating the governments in your cities and countries. I know that's what I want to do in the future.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Yes, absolutely. That's so powerful. I keep saying these same words over and over because every one of your answers is incredible. But we have about 10 minutes left with Eduarda. So if you have any questions just bubbling up in your mind that you want asked, put them in the chat now, because we do want to respect her time, but we also have so many things we have to learn from her. Yes. Yep, so put your questions in the chat if you have any further. And I have one more for you. I think you're obviously a policy student that plays into government, that plays into intergovernmental organizations and things like the UN. But I mean, personally, I've seen a lot in recent years of companies that are still investing in so deeply in fossil fuels and a lot of activism that goes straight up against them. And places like BlackRock, there's students protest. They're the biggest investor in coal and other dirty energy around the world, and there's students standing outside, fighting against them. And do you think that that's an effective form of action against directly corporate, trying to push corporate responsibility, or do you see the future more in policy?
Oh no, I think it's 50-50. I think that they are so important to making things differently. What I can say is, especially first of all, I think that a very common misconception of the energy sector is putting a lot of blame in the international oil companies, which are the big ones are Shell, BP, ExxonMobil, Chevron, the ones you all know. When we sometimes forget that national oil companies, they nowadays have a higher share of oil reserves in the world than the actual international oil companies. So when I say this to companies inside our own countries, so in Brazil, it's Petrobras. We have in Saudi Arabia, we have Saudi Aramco. So Russia has one, China has one, Mexico has one. These national oil companies, they're actually nowadays emitting more greenhouse gases than international oil companies. And the reality is that international oil companies are the ones that are being pressured by the Black Rocks, by financial institutions to change. They're completely changing their business models because they know that they're going to cease to exist if they don't do something. And I invite everyone to take a look at, especially BP's sustainability report. A lot of organizations, criticize most of the methodologies these companies use, but BP has been one that even the greenest environmentalists have been recognizing, acknowledging that they've been changing their operations, and they have heavily divested from new upstream investments. Upstream is that when you do the actual extraction of oil, right? So you have to think that an oil and gas company doesn't deal only with extraction. They also sometimes own refineries. They're also responsible for the transportation. So it's also not a business that you can change overnight. So I think in terms of being realistic of how we're going to do this transition, I think BP is a good example of a company who's doing it. Shell is also another one that has been recently coming up with more and more ambitious targets for net zero. So I do think that they have a huge responsibility. But one thing I see with activists is that they're not targeting the national oil companies. Seriously, you see in all COPs, you see in all these events that they always point the finger to these companies that I just mentioned, which are also to blame. But we have to remember that within our countries, some of our countries are, the biggest oil and gas producers in the world. So I think that that's very important. And another tip that I would give, this is specific to the energy sector, but there's an organization that I've done youth-related work with called the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. They had a CEO who was very open, who welcomed youth through student energy, that if you guys don't know is nowadays the biggest, largest youth-led NGO that deals with energy and tries to shape the next generation of energy leaders. Student energy is amazing, and I was part of a challenge team, which we had representatives from each continent to provide feedback to oil and gas companies that are members. And members of OGCI, of this coalition, were both national oil companies and international oil companies. We did this almost full year trying to write them recommendations and say what they had to change. And the outcome of this work was very, very interesting, because deep down I had hope that they would listen to us. And they decided not to adopt any of our recommendations as a decision of the board, which had to be unanimous. And they couldn't tell us which companies voted against our propositions. But we know for a fact that some companies were in favor and some were against, which again comes to show that I don't like putting everyone in the same, buckle, just saying oh, the oil and gas sector is awful, they're the enemy. There are people, and I talked to a lot of managers and even CEOs of some of these organizations, of these oil and gas companies. Some of them are incredible in the sense that they're really making their homework and trying to listen to youth, trying to make a difference, hiring more and more, more women, hiring more people that are diverse, hiring more people from the global South, giving them more leadership role. We've discussed all of that, but some of them are still the same and are not changing because of leadership, because of the people who own the company, the people who own the assets. So I think there's also, what I'm trying to say is that it's not just the government. These companies, they need a pressure that has to deal with the government. We need governments to stop subsidizing fossil fuels or giving tax breaks to oil and gas companies. This still happens all around the world. And instead of giving the subsidies to renewable energy, they give subsidies to fossil fuels, which is one of the things that I'm most interested in learning how to deal with. And it's not simple. It's not something you learn in a master's. It's something that it's hard, because you're trying to shift an entire, you're trying to change the entire system and how it has operated for the past 50, 100 years. So it's really hard to make change. That's why, again, we need more people, not only the governments, but also in these companies.
Yeah, wow. There is space for everyone, everywhere, from private to public to government. Alrighty, we're approaching our time and we're going to close out. Eduarda, thank you so much. I'm going to watch this recording over and over. I've learned so much from you today. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, non-binary people, global youth climate visionary, Eduarda Zobi.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to be here. And everyone, if you feel free to reach out to me. I don't know if I can say my email or my information,
Absolutely.
but yeah, no, but